Snippy, Spotty and Snowy huddled together in the dim light of their burrow. Snippy pressed a finger against a leaf map, tracing a jagged line toward the village. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we head to the market. We get the carrot candy, the apple cake, and the ride on the happy cars." Snowy hopped in place, his ears twitching with anticipation. "I will wake at dawn, wash, and be ready." Snippy nodded, his expression serious. "We leave early. We return before the sun dips. No exceptions." They scrambled toward the burrow entrance, eager for the morning, but stopped short. Duck Auntie blocked their path. She stood rigid, her gaze fixed on the dark tree line. She leaned in, her voice dropping. "A wolf has been prowling the deep woods. Travel together, stay on the path, be home before the shadows stretch long." Snippy gripped a stone, his knuckles tight, and nodded. The warning hung in the air, cold and heavy. They stepped out into the morning light, but the forest no longer looked like a playground. It looked like a trap. The forest edge fell away, replaced by the chaotic hum of the village market. Snippy led the way, his nose twitching at the scent of fresh greens and warm sugar. They navigated the crowded stalls, grabbing bundles of crisp lettuce and sweet clover. But the real prize waited further in. They reached the candy store, where Snowy lunged for a carrot sweet, devouring it in 2 bites. His eyes widened, reflecting the vibrant colors of the display. They moved faster now, shedding the caution they had carried through the woods. The happy cars sat in the center of the square, a spinning blur of motion. They climbed into the small vehicles, gripping the steering wheels as the ride lurched into gear. They bumped into each other, spinning in wide, dizzying circles. Laughter echoed through the square, drowning out the distant, rhythmic ticking of the village clock. They raced again, and then again, chasing the thrill of the collision. Time became a blur of motion and sugar. They ignored the shifting angle of the sun, focused only on the next turn and the next bump. The world outside the market walls ceased to exist. They were trapped in a loop of pure kinetic energy, oblivious to the fact that the light was beginning to lean toward the horizon. The ride slowed, the mechanical hum dying down into a rhythmic clatter. Snippy hopped out, his head spinning, and looked up. The sky had lost its bright midday glow. It was bruised, a deep, darkening purple that seemed to press down on the village rooftops. He scanned the horizon. The first stars were already pricking through the haze. His heart lurched. He turned to his brothers, his voice sharp and urgent. "The sun is setting! We stayed too long!" Spotty froze, his ears dropping. Snowy blinked, the sugar rush fading into sudden cold clarity. The market was emptying, the stall owners pulling down heavy shutters with a final echoing thud. Snippy didn't wait for a response. He bolted toward the village gate, his paws hitting the cobblestones in a frantic rhythm. "Run!" he shouted back. They sprinted, leaving the scent of cakes and sweets behind. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of black silhouettes against the dying light. They reached the edge of the woods, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees, which had seemed like a path home earlier, now stood like jagged claws against the twilight. Snippy skidded to a halt, his eyes darting into the brush. The brothers plunged into the tree line, their paws thudding against the damp, leaf-strewn ground. Snippy took the lead, eyes fixed on the narrow trail ahead. "Keep close," he commanded. his voice barely rising above the rustle of dry brush. They moved in a tight formation, but the forest floor was treacherous, choked with gnarled roots and deep shadows. Then a sharp, earthy scent cut through the stale air. It was wild carrot. Snowy slowed, his nose twitching. The smell was intense, pulling at his senses like a physical tether. He took one step off the path, then another, drawn by the promise of the sweet, crisp root. He found a thicket, pulled a carrot from the dirt, and crunched into it. The sound was deafening in the stillness. He reached for another, his focus narrowing entirely. When he finally looked up, the trail was empty. The darkness had thickened, turning the trees into featureless pillars of black. He spun around, his ears straining for the sound of his brothers, but there was only the wind moving through the high branches. Snippy, Spotty, his voice was a thin, trembling squeak that vanished into the vast, suffocating gloom. He turned in frantic circles, his heart hammering against his ribs. The path was gone. He was alone. Snowy stood frozen, his breath hitching in his throat. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. A shadow detached itself from the base of a gnarled oak, shifting with a fluid, predatory grace that defied the stillness. Snowy squinted into the gloom. Two yellow eyes ignited, fixed directly on him with a cold, piercing intensity. He tried to turn, to bolt back toward where the path should be, but his legs felt heavy, unresponsive. The figure stepped into a sliver of moonlight. The wolf stood tall, his presence filling the clearing. Snowy whispered a plea, his voice cracking, but the wolf only let out a low, vibrating growl. The wolf lunged. It was a blur of motion. Before Snowy could react, a heavy, massive paw slammed down, pinning him. "Tonight," the wolf hissed, "I feast." Snowy squeezed his eyes shut, the reality of his mistake settling in. Snippy and Spotty burst into the forest clearing, their chests heaving with exertion. They skidded to a halt, scanning the empty trail. The silence of the woods was absolute. Snippy called out, his voice sharp and demanding, but only the wind answered. Spotty began to pace, his paws digging into the dirt as he circled the thicket. "He is not here," Spotty whispered. Panic flared in Snippy's eyes. They fanned out, pushing through the dense undergrowth, snapping twigs. Suddenly, a frantic rustle erupted from the brush. Dinky Deer broke through the foliage. "I saw him," Dinky panted, pointing toward the cave entrance. "The wolf has him." Snippy gripped a heavy branch. "Follow me," Snippy commanded. They turned and sprinted toward the cave. The cave entrance loomed ahead, a jagged tear in the hillside. Snippy and Spotty rounded the final bend, their paws pounding against the hard, packed earth. Inside the dim light of the cave mouth, the wolf stood over Snowy, his muscles coiled and ready to strike. The sound of the wolf's low, guttural laughter echoed off the stone walls, vibrating through the damp air. Snippy did not slow down. He did not call out. He planted his back feet, shifted his weight, and hurled the heavy branch with every ounce of strength in his body. It flew true, a dark streak through the gloom. The wood connected with a sickening thud against the wolf's nose. The predator let out a sharp, surprised howl, his head snapping back as he stumbled away from his prey. The heavy paw lifted, releasing its grip on the ground. Snippy screamed, "Run!" The command cut through the tension like a whip. Snowy scrambled to his feet, his limbs shaking but functional. He did not hesitate. They did not stop. They did not look back. Brambles tore at their sides, but they pushed through. Driven by the memory of the wolf's growl, the forest canopy finally broke, revealing the familiar mound of their home. Snippy reached the entrance first, sliding into the dark tunnel with Spotty and Snowy close behind. He spun around, pulled the heavy wooden latch shut, and pressed his weight against the door until the lock clicked into place. Outside, the woods remained silent. Inside, the three brothers collapsed on the floor, their chests heaving in unison. They were trembling, but they were whole. They would never wander again. The forest floor was a labyrinth of tangled roots and slick, damp moss. Snippy moved with purpose, his ears twitching at every snap of a twig or rustle of dead leaves. He did not look back until the trees grew thick enough to blot out the sky. He stopped abruptly, his body tense, and turned to face his brothers. His gaze was sharp, locking onto them with absolute focus. Snowy, listen carefully. Do not stop for food. Do not wander. Stay right behind me no matter what you hear or smell. Snowy nodded quickly, his paws shifting nervously on the uneven ground. "Yes, brother," he replied, his voice barely rising above the wind. Snippy scanned the perimeter one last time, his nose testing the air for any sign of movement. The shadows between the trunks seemed to stretch and shift. He gave a firm nod, signaling them to move forward again. They kept their pace tight, three figures moving through the gloom. A sudden break in the canopy revealed a sun-drenched clearing. The light hit the ground, illuminating a patch of wild carrots that glowed with an intense earthy orange. The scent was immediate, sweet, rich, and impossible to ignore. Snowy slowed his pace, his nose twitching as he stared at the vibrant patch. His brothers continued forward, their forms fading into the deeper brush ahead. "Just one," he whispered, his resolve crumbling. "I can catch up in seconds." He stepped off the path and sank his teeth into the first root. The crunch echoed through the quiet woods, sharp and satisfying. He pulled another, then another, his movements becoming frantic as he shoveled the food into his mouth. He did not notice the sun dipping below the horizon. He did not hear the wind shift or the birds go silent. The forest grew dim, the shadows stretching into long, thin fingers. Snowy reached for one more, his stomach full, and finally looked up to find the path. It was empty. The trail he had been following was gone. "Snippy? Spotty?" he called out, his voice thin and trembling. Only the rustle of dry leaves answered him. The silence was absolute, and the realization hit him. He was alone. The silence of the woods became suffocating. Snowy took a step, then another, his breath hitching in his chest. He broke into a frantic sprint, his paws sliding on loose dirt and tangled roots. Every tree he passed looked like a reaching hand. He stumbled, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Snippy! Spotty!" he shrieked, but the forest swallowed his voice. He skidded to a halt near a dense thicket, his lungs burning. The air suddenly grew cold, A shadow detached itself from the wall of thorns. Snowy froze, his muscles locking tight. He stared into the gloom, hoping for a familiar silhouette. "Brother, is that you?" he whispered. A low, gravelly chuckle vibrated through the air, sounding like grinding stones. Two yellow eyes ignited in the dark, burning with a predatory hunger. The figure stepped forward, towering over the clearing. "I am not your brother, little rabbit," the voice growled. Snowy turned to bolt, but a massive, heavy paw slammed down, pinning him firmly to the damp earth. Snowy let out a high, thin cry. The wolf did not hesitate. He scooped the small, struggling form into a coarse burlap sack and cinched the top tight. The fabric was rough, smelling of earth and old prey. He slung the bundle over his shoulder, the weight shifting with every step as he marched toward his cave. His claws scraped rhythmically against the bark of trees, a sound of impending doom. He muttered to himself, his voice a low, hungry rasp. "Tonight I dine on roast rabbit." Inside the dark, stifling confines of the sack, Snowy wept, his mind replaying the warnings he had ignored. Miles away, the forest path felt suddenly wrong. Spotty stopped, his ears swiveling toward the empty trail behind them. "Snippy, stop!" he called out. "Snowy is gone!" Snippy spun around, his expression hardening into a mask of focused intensity. He dropped to the ground, scanning the forest floor, until he spotted a trail of disturbed dirt. A dinky deer emerged from the nearby bushes, its limbs shaking. "I saw the wolf," the deer bleated. "He carried a sack toward his cave." Snippy turned to Spotty, his jaw set. "We have a plan. I will lure him away. When he chases me, you cut the sack and run." The cave entrance loomed like a jagged wound in the hillside. Snippy signaled to Spotty, who melted into the shadows of the nearby ferns. Snippy took a deep breath, stepped out from behind a thick trunk, and hopped into the center of the clearing. He stood still, his ears alert, making himself a clear target. Inside the cave, the wolf heard the movement and emerged, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the lone figure. The wolf dropped the burlap sack onto the rocky ground with a heavy thud, his lips curled back, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Two more? A feast for a week!" The wolf snarled, his voice echoing against the stone walls. He lunged, his massive frame surging forward with terrifying speed. Snippy did not wait. He bolted his paws, finding purchase on the slick earth as he dove into the dense, thorny underbrush. The wolf crashed through the bushes behind him, snapping branches and tearing through vines. Thorns whipped at Snippy's face, but he pushed harder, darting through narrow gaps where the larger predator struggled to follow. Every second was a gamble. The chase was on, a blur of green and brown. Spotty watched from the shadows until the wolf's heavy, crashing footsteps faded into the distance. He darted toward the discarded sack, his eyes scanning the rocky ground for a tool. He scrambled over the dirt, his paws frantic, until he found a jagged, flint-like stone. It was sharp enough. He pressed the edge against the coarse burlap and sawed with all his strength. The fabric resisted, then tore with a sharp, ripping sound. Snowy tumbled out, his eyes wide and wet with terror, his limbs shaking from the confinement. Spotty did not waste a second. "Quick, run!" he hissed. nudging Snowy toward the dense tree line. Snowy scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he realized the path to freedom was open. Together, they sprinted away from the cave, their paws barely touching the earth as they wove through the thicket. Behind them, the forest remained silent, save for the distant, fading roars of the wolf, still hunting a decoy that was no longer there. They did not look back. They pushed through the undergrowth, dodging roots and low-hanging branches, driven by the singular need to reach the safety of their burrow. They were tired, but they were moving away from the danger. The wolf returned to the cave entrance, his chest heaving and his breath coming in ragged, angry gasps. He had lost the trail in the thicket, the scent of the small prey vanishing into the damp earth. He stomped into the dark interior, his claws clicking sharply against the stone floor. He spotted the burlap sack exactly where he had dropped it. He grabbed the top of the fabric, feeling the heavy, solid weight inside. A low, satisfied rumble vibrated in his throat. He hauled the sack toward the fire, where a large iron pot sat bubbling over the flames. With a rough shove, he tossed the entire bundle into the boiling water. The steam hissed and swirled, filling the cave with the scent of damp fibers. He paced in tight circles, rubbing his massive paws together. He waited until the bubbling slowed, then reached out with a clawed hand to lift the heavy lid. He leaned in, expecting the sight of his meal. Instead, he stared at a jagged grey stone resting at the bottom. The wolf threw his head back and let out a roar of absolute earth-shaking fury. Snowy and Spotty collapsed into the entrance of the burrow, their sides heaving with exhaustion. The tunnel was cool and narrow, a stark contrast to the vast, dangerous forest they had just escaped. Snowy crawled into the furthest corner, his paws trembling against the packed earth. He did not look at his brother. He kept his head bowed, his chin pressed against his chest. Spotty sat by the entrance, his ears swiveling to catch the slightest sound. The silence between them was heavy. Snowy finally spoke, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "I am sorry," he said. Spotty turned, his gaze stern and unyielding in the dim light. "He is in danger because you were careless, Snowy," he replied. Every rustle of a leaf outside made him flinch. They waited in the stifling quiet, the weight of their brother's absence pressing down on them. Snowy promised himself he would never let his hunger override his caution again. They sat in the dark, waiting for a sign. The burrow remained silent, save for the rhythmic, shallow breathing of the two rabbits huddled near the back wall. Every shadow in the tunnel seemed to stretch and shift, mimicking the movements of the forest outside. Snowy kept his eyes fixed on the entrance, his muscles coiled and ready to bolt. Then a sharp rustle of dry leaves echoed. Both rabbits scrambled backward, their hearts hammering against the packed earth. A silhouette blocked the dim moonlight. A head poked through, followed by a weary, stumbling gait. It was Snippy. He collapsed into the center of the burrow, his chest rising and falling in rapid, heavy bursts. His fur was matted with damp leaves and bits of forest debris. Snowy did not hesitate. He lunged forward, burying his face into the thick, familiar fur of his brother's neck. Snippy let out a long, shuddering breath, his eyes slowly losing their sharp, defensive edge. "I am home," he whispered. Spotty moved closer, pressing his side against Snippy to share the warmth. They huddled together in a tight, protective circle. Their collective heat rising against the damp chill of the earth. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but the sound was distant. Here, in the deep, dark safety of the ground, the danger of the forest finally faded into the stillness of the night.